When I entered my student advisor office in the fall of 2005, I was married without children. 9 years later, I have 2 beautiful children, but I'm no longer married.
We all remember that 2009 Thanksgiving night, the fire hydrant, the shattered glass, and the world's most famous marriage imploding in real time. In the past, Elin Nordegren was simply the silent wife of Tiger Woods, a figure defined by his shadow and his scandals.
When I received the phone call, I felt really happy, but I also was a little surprised because I've been called a woman with no word in the media and criticized for not talking very much.
But seeing her in 2026 is a shock to the system. She didn't just survive the fallout, she orchestrated a quiet, stunning revolution, trading the tabloid glare for a life that is authentically, finally, hers. Take a deep breath before seeing a new Elin today. The change no one expected. Did Elin get her nose done? New set of teeth? Did she get miserable? Some people might root for her failure, but Elin stood up and claimed herself back after all the scandals she went through. The transformation of Elin Nordegren is not the typical Hollywood glow-up involving a reality TV contract and a new line of lifestyle vitamins. No, the 2026 version of the woman once known as the stoic, silent shadow of the greatest golfer in history is something far more radical. She is entirely, stubbornly normal. To see her today at a South Florida youth sports complex, clutching a lukewarm coffee, wearing a sensible linen blazer, and corralling a small army of children is to witness a person who has successfully performed a vanishing act in plain sight. She didn't just leave a marriage, she left the very concept of celebrity at the curb. And in doing so, she became the most intriguing person in the room. The most jarring shift isn't just that she looks radiant. At 46, she possesses a kind of weathered serenity that only comes from surviving a Category 5 social hurricane, but that she is now a mother of 6. For those who still picture her with just Sam and Charlie, the math of her current life is the first deep breath moment. Since 2019, Elin and her partner, former NFL star Jordan Cameron, have built a sprawling, blended kingdom. With 3 young children of their own, Zeta, Freya, and Arthur, plus Jordan's son from a previous relationship, her world is a whirlwind of school runs, teething, and teenager drama. The Swedish nanny, who once cared for the world's elite, is now the CEO of a household that requires more logistics than a PGA Tour stop. But the real twist in the Elin Nordegren metamorphosis isn't found in her family tree. It's found on her office door. While the world waited for her to write a tell-all book or sit down with Oprah for a $20 million interview, Elin was quietly sitting in a classroom at Rollins College. She didn't just get a degree to pass the time, she chased a calling. Today, she is a licensed mental health counselor with her own private practice, EN Therapy. Imagine the poetic irony. The woman whose private trauma was dissected by every tabloid on the planet now spends her days helping others navigate their own emotional wreckage. She took the shards of her broken glass and turned them into a lens through which she helps others see clearly. In 2026, her relationship with Tiger Woods has reached a state of grace that many found impossible to imagine back in 2009. They aren't just cordial co-parents. They are genuine allies. When Charlie Woods received his state championship ring earlier this year, there was Elin standing inches away from her ex-husband, laughing as if the fire hydrant and the scandals were a lifetime ago. This is the ultimate transformation. She refused to be a victim, and she refused to be a villain. She chose to be a healer. The woman we see today isn't Tiger's ex. She is a powerhouse mother, a dedicated therapist, and a woman who proved that the best way to handle a public explosion is to walk away from the blast zone and build a garden in the quiet space beyond. She didn't just survive the storm, she became the calm that follows it, proving that your past is only a prologue if you have the courage to turn the page. Now, no one wouldn't even make her transformation a big deal if not because of the rubble she climbed out of. The billion-dollar rebuild. To learn the sheer magnitude of Elin Nordegren's 2026 reality, one must look past the blonde hair and the serene Florida sunshine to the calculated intellectual architecture of her independence. When the dust settled on the most expensive divorce in sports history, the world expected a cliché. We expected a spree of revenge shopping, a series of high-profile flings with European counts, or perhaps a permanent retreat to a private island in the Swedish archipelago. Instead, Elin did something far more subversive. She went to school. She didn't just enroll, she stayed for a decade. The twist in this story isn't that she stayed rich, it's that she became a scholar of the very human emotions that had once been weaponized against her by the global media machine. At Rollins College, she wasn't the ex-wife or a tabloid fixture. She was a student of psychology. There is a profound, almost cinematic irony in the fact that while the paparazzi were literally climbing trees to get a blurry shot of her through a window, Elin was sitting in a fluorescent-lit classroom studying the fight-or-flight response and the mechanics of trauma. This wasn't a vanity project. By the time she stood at the podium as the 2014 commencement speaker, graduating with a 3.96 GPA, she had effectively dismantled the scorned woman narrative. She replaced it with the image of a woman who understood exactly why her life had imploded and, more importantly, how to build a foundation that no scandal could ever shake again. This academic journey was the secret engine behind her billion-dollar rebuild. While her settlement was estimated at $100 million, her true wealth in 2026 is her absolute autonomy. She didn't just buy a house, she built a fortress of privacy. She famously demolished a $12 million North Palm Beach mansion just to rebuild it from the ground up, a metaphor for her life that was lost on no one. But the true masterpiece of her reconstruction is her career as a licensed mental health counselor. Think about that for a moment. The woman who was once the most hunted prey of the shame industrial complex now spends 40 hours a week holding space for other people's pain. She turned her own experience of public humiliation into a professional credential, proving that the best way to handle a trauma is to master the science of it. By the time we see her in early 2026, the transformation is complete. She has achieved what so few in the orbit of great men ever do. She eclipsed the shadow of the man she left. In her private practice, EN Therapy, she isn't Tiger's former partner. She is a clinician. This is the ultimate autonomy. She isn't waiting for a check or a mention in a sports biography. She is a working professional with a bustling household of 6 children who likely view her Tiger Woods era as a strange, ancient myth from a different century. The twist is that the Tiger's X label has finally fallen off, not because of time, but because she outgrew the skin of that identity. She didn't just survive the 2009 firestorm. She used the heat to forge a version of herself that is entirely unrecognizable to the girl who once carried a golf bag in Sweden. Before the quiet, however, there was the roar and a wedding that felt like a royal coronation. The Swedish nanny and the prodigy. To truly grasp the magnitude of the woman standing in the 2026 Florida sun, one must travel back to a time when Elin Nordegren was not a household name, but a quiet, strikingly beautiful student in Stockholm with a very different dream. Long before the private jets and the billion-dollar divorces, Elin and her twin sister, Josephine, were working summer jobs at a local clothing store to fund their education. It was a life of simple Swedish sensibilities, clean lines, hard work, and an almost sacred devotion to privacy. The twist in this fairy tale, however, didn't involve a glass slipper. It involved a job offer as a nanny for Swedish golfer Jesper Parnevik. It was this move to the United States that would inadvertently place her in the crosshairs of a sporting revolution. When she packed her bags for Florida, she wasn't looking for a billionaire. She was looking for a way to pay for her psychology textbooks. At the time, Tiger Woods was not just a golfer. He was a global deity, a corporate titan who seemed to exist on a different atmospheric plane than the rest of humanity. When he first laid eyes on Elin, she wasn't impressed by the red shirts or the trophy counts. In fact, she initially turned him down. She was a young woman focused on her studies in child psychology, uninterested in the high-octane, ego-driven circus that trailed the world's #1 athlete. This was the first hint of the grit she would later display. She didn't need the spotlight then, and she certainly didn't crave it later. But Tiger, known for his relentless pursuit of any goal, was persistent. The courtship was a whirlwind of international travel and hushed conversations, a prodigy meeting his match in a woman who refused to be dazzled by his fame. It was a clash of two worlds, the loud, commercialized American dream and the quiet, reserved Swedish reality. As their relationship deepened in the early 2000s, the contrast between them was cinematic. Tiger was the American dream personified, dominant and historical, while Elin was the Nordic calm, the grounding force who provided a sanctuary away from the cameras. She was the silent queen of the PGA Tour, a fixture in the gallery who never gave an interview and never sought the microphone. Friends from that era describe her as fiercely protective of their bubble. The creative irony here is that the very wall of privacy she helped Tiger build around their lives would eventually be the same wall that hid the secrets that would one day bring the entire structure crashing down. She was unknowingly guarding a fortress that was already beginning to hollow out from the inside. She was the anchor for a man who was increasingly adrift in his own mythos. In this chapter of her life, Elin wasn't a victim or a therapist. She was a partner in the construction of a legacy. She navigated the transition from a Swedish nanny to the partner of a billionaire with a grace that felt effortless, but in reality was a masterclass in adaptation. She learned the nuances of the American country club circuit while maintaining a stoic European detachment that kept the tabloids at bay for years. They were the golden couple, a vision of perfection that seemed physically impossible to break. But even then, as she stood by his side during his historic wins, there was a sense that Elin was always looking for something more substantial than a trophy. A search for identity that would eventually lead her far away from the fairways and into the quiet life she leads today in 2026. The world saw a trophy wife, but those close to her saw a woman who was constantly reading, constantly observing, and constantly preparing for a life that didn't involve golf. While Tiger was perfecting his swing, Elin was perfecting the art of being invisible while standing in the middle of a stadium. This era was defined by a strange, beautiful tension, the most famous man in the world being anchored by a woman who wanted nothing to do with his fame. It was a partnership of opposites that, for a few years, seemed to work perfectly. They were young, they were beautiful, and they were untouchable. Or so the world thought. The seeds of the 2026 version of Elin, the independent clinical psychologist, were being sown in the quiet moments between tournaments as she realized that being the wife of was a role she could play, but not a person she could be. By the time 2003 rolled around, The nanny label had been scrubbed away by the sheer force of their collective star power. Elin had become a fixture of high society, yet she remained an enigma. She didn't do the talk show circuit. She didn't launch a perfume. She remained a ghost in the machine. A woman who understood that in the world of Tiger Woods, the only way to maintain one's soul was to keep it hidden. This period of their lives was the calm before the ultimate storm, a time of private jets and quiet dinners, where the only thing louder than Tiger's success was the silence Elin maintained. Little did she know that this very silence would become her greatest weapon in the years to follow. Long after the wedding bells had stopped ringing. Before the quiet, however, there was the roar and a wedding that felt like a royal coronation. The $10 million sunset. In the grand, sweeping history of celebrity unions, few spectacles have ever matched the sheer, defiant opulence of October 5th, 2004. For Elin Nordegren, the journey from a quiet Swedish upbringing to the altar of the Sandy Lane Resort in Barbados was more than a wedding. It was a royal coronation that signaled her official entry into the upper echelon of global icons. Tiger Woods, then the undisputed king of the sporting world, didn't just host a ceremony. He staged a takeover of an entire island. To ensure the level of privacy that Elin craved and that Tiger required, he spent a reported $1.5 million to rent the entire 112-room Sandy Lane complex for over a week. He famously chartered every helicopter on the island and even rented out the only local boat company to ensure no paparazzi could approach by air or sea. It was a fortress of romance, built with the kind of precision Tiger usually reserved for a Sunday at Augusta. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of quiet luxury before the term even existed. Under a white-netted pagoda decorated with 10,000 black roses, flown in specifically from around the globe, Elin stood at the 19th hole of the Green Monkey Golf Course. At 24 years old, she was the picture of effortless elegance in an off-white sleeveless gown, her blonde hair catching the last rays of a Caribbean sunset that seemed staged just for her. The guest list was a who's who of American excellence. Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley were in attendance, as was Oprah Winfrey, all witnessing the union of a man who seemed invincible and a woman who seemed to be his perfect, stabilizing counterpart. The air was filled with the scent of lilies and the sounds of hootie and the blowfish performing under a massive tent. It was a $10 million sunset that promised a lifetime of untouchable happiness. However, looking back from the vantage point of 2026, the creative irony of that day is staggering. The most expensive detail of the wedding wasn't the roses or the caviar, it was the privacy. That was the name of the 155-foot luxury yacht where the couple spent their first night as husband and wife. The ship was a floating metaphor for the marriage they intended to build, one shielded from the world, armored against scrutiny, and entirely self-contained. For Elin, the wedding represented the ultimate security. She wasn't just marrying a man, she was marrying into a level of protection that most people only read about in fairways and fables. She had no way of knowing that the very walls they were building to keep the world out would eventually serve to keep a devastating series of secrets in. The celebration concluded with a fireworks display so massive it could be seen from miles away along the Barbados coast, lighting up the night sky in a shower of gold and silver. To the 120 guests watching from the beach, it looked like the start of an eternal dynasty. For Elin, it was the moment she transitioned from an independent Swedish student to the Mrs. Woods of the world's imagination. As they sailed away on the privacy, the image of the perfect couple was etched into the collective consciousness. It was a wedding designed to be unforgettable. But for Elin, it would eventually become a memory of a version of herself she would have to completely dismantle and rebuild. The 2004 Barbados sunset was the peak of the mountain, a breathtaking height from which the fall, years later, would be just as spectacular. But behind the fireworks and the 10,000 roses, the first cracks were already beginning to spider through the gold. The cracks in the trophy. If the Barbados wedding was a masterclass in cinematic perfection, the years that followed were a slow-motion study in the erosion of a myth. By the mid-2000s, the golden couple had settled into a life of staggering routine in their Windermere, Florida estate. A life that, on the surface, looked like the ultimate victory lap. To the public, Elin Nordegren was the picture of the contented matriarch, the serene anchor for a man who was busy rewriting the record books. In 2007, the arrival of their daughter, Sam Alexis, seemed to complete the puzzle. Named after Tiger's father's nickname for him, Sam was the first heir to the Woods dynasty, and Elin leaned into motherhood with a fierce, protective intensity. She wasn't interested in being a socialite. She was interested in being a mother, often seen pushing a stroller through the quiet, gated streets of Isleworth, far from the cameras that hounded her husband at every turn. The creative tragedy of this period is that while Elin was nesting and building a home, the foundations of that home were already beginning to rot. Tiger's dominance on the course was absolute, but the pressure of maintaining that perfection was manifesting in a double life that was as complex as his short game. By the time their son, Charlie Axel, was born in early 2009, the cracks in the trophy were no longer just metaphorical. The domestic bliss that the world envied was becoming a gilded cage. Elin was living a life of radical isolation. She was a woman in a foreign country, surrounded by a tight-knit circle of Tiger's handlers, security, and fixers, whose primary job was to ensure that the image remained pristine. The irony of 2026 is realizing that during these years, Elin was arguably the most famous woman in the world, who was also the most alone. As Charlie's birth brought a new wave of public celebration, the private reality was shifting. Tiger was often away, chasing history, while Elin was managing a growing household and a husband who was becoming increasingly distant. The silent queen wasn't just silent because she was private. She was silent because she was navigating a growing sense of unease that she couldn't quite name. She was the architect of a sanctuary that her husband was using as a temporary pit stop between two very different worlds. The whispers that would eventually become a roar were already circulating in the dark corners of the internet. But Elin, ever the stoic Swede, focused on the children. She believed in the sanctity of the family unit they had built, unaware that she was the only one truly committed to the privacy they had celebrated on their wedding night. The mid-2000s were the years where the Tiger Woods brand became so large it eclipsed the human beings inside the house. Elin was no longer seen as a person with her own ambitions. She was a supporting character in a global marketing campaign. But even then, there were glimpses of the woman we see in 2026, the woman who would eventually seek a career in psychology. She was an observer, a student of the high-stakes, high-stress environment she inhabited. She was learning in real time the cost of greatness and the price of deception. While the world saw a woman who had everything, the houses, the yachts, the beautiful children, Elin was beginning to see the hollowness of the pedestal. The cracks were spidering through the gold, and it would only take one cold November night for the entire structure to shatter into a million pieces. The silence was about to be broken by the sound of a SUV hitting a tree, and the world would never look at either of them the same way again. The Thanksgiving firestorm. The transition from the golden couple to the most salacious headline in history didn't happen over months or weeks. It happened in a few frantic minutes in the pre-dawn darkness of November 27, 2009. To understand why we are all still taking a deep breath when we see Elin today in 2026, you have to revisit the debris field of that Thanksgiving night. A scene so surreal it felt less like a police report and more like a fever dream. At 2:25 a.m., a black Cadillac Escalade lurched out of the driveway of the Woods Isleworth mansion, clipped a fire hydrant, and careered into a neighbor's tree. But the damage to the car was secondary to the damage to the myth. When the police arrived, they found Tiger Woods lying in the street, semi-conscious and bleeding from the mouth, with Elin Nordegren standing over him, clutching a golf club. The creative twist of that night, and the one that launched 1,000 memes, was the golf club itself. The initial narrative spun by the Woods camp was one of heroism. Elin, hearing the crash from inside the house, had supposedly grabbed a club, run into the night, and smashed the rear window to pull her husband to safety. It was a story of a devoted wife rescuing her partner from a freak accident. But within 48 hours, the story began to bleed. The world started asking the questions that still echo today. Why was Tiger leaving the house at 2:30 in the morning? Why did he hit a hydrant just yards from his own front door? And why did Elin need to smash the back window of a low-speed crash to rescue a man in the driver's seat? The firestorm was fueled by a report that had surfaced just 2 days earlier in the National Enquirer, alleging an affair between Tiger and a New York nightclub hostess. As more details leaked, the heroic rescue narrative shifted into something far more visceral. Rumors swirled that Elin had discovered a burner phone or a text message while Tiger was asleep, reportedly groggy from a sleeping pill, and that the crash wasn't a getaway, but a flight. The image of the silent queen was replaced by a woman in a state of high-octane, righteous fury, allegedly chasing the SUV down the driveway with that now infamous iron. The shattered glass of the Cadillac became the shattered glass of their $10 million sunset. And as the sun rose on Florida that morning, the world realized that the privacy they had spent millions to maintain was gone forever. For Elin, this was the moment the pedestal became a target. In the 20 days that followed, she was the centerpiece of a record-breaking tabloid run. She was forced to endure a public autopsy of her marriage as a parade of mistresses, waitresses, porn stars, and hostesses emerged from the woodwork to claim their piece of the Tiger Woods story. The Thanksgiving firestorm wasn't just about a car crash. It was the total, violent deconstruction of a woman's reality in front of a global audience. The creative irony of 2026 is that the very club Elin held that night, once seen as a symbol of a marriage's violent end, now serves as the starting point for her transformation. She took the weapon of her husband's trade and used it to break out of the gilded cage he had built around her. The night ended with Tiger in a hospital bed and Elin facing a world that suddenly felt like a predator. But if the crash was the explosion, the aftermath was the forge. While the media waited for her to crumble, or better yet, to scream, Elin retreated back into that trademark Swedish silence. This time, however, the silence wasn't a shield for Tiger. It was a sanctuary for herself. She didn't grant the interviews. She didn't sell the photos. She simply waited for the smoke to clear so she could begin the long, quiet walk toward the life she has now. A life where she is the one holding the cards, far away from the fire hydrants and the flickering blue lights of the Windermere police. With the fire still smoldering, the most famous silent partner in the world had a choice: stay in the ruins or build a new kingdom from the ashes. The aftermath and the new kingdom. The smoke from the 2009 firestorm didn't clear overnight. It lingered for years as a toxic cloud of litigation and public scrutiny. Yet, as we stand in the clear air of 2026, the resolution of Elin Nordegren's story feels less like a tabloid finale and more like a triumph of the human spirit. Following a $100 million settlement that many called hush money, Elin proved that her silence was never for sale. It was simply her natural state of dignity. She took that capital and invested it into a life of radical substance, moving from the shadow of a global icon into the light of her own professional and personal success. The new kingdom Elin has built is a blended, bustling marvel. Alongside her partner, Jordan Cameron, she has navigated the complexities of co-parenting with Tiger in a way that has baffled the skeptics. The man who once broke her world is now a frequent guest at her dinner table, a best friend who stands beside her at their children's milestones. This isn't just playing nice for the cameras. It is the practical application of the psychology she spent a decade studying. She didn't just learn how to heal others at Rollins College, she learned how to heal her own family tree. Today, Elin is no longer the Swedish nanny or the golf wife. She is a mother of 6, a licensed therapist, and a woman who successfully reclaimed her name from the clutches of a scandal that would have buried a lesser person. To see her today is to see a woman who took a deep breath in the middle of a hurricane and didn't exhale until she had reached the shore. She is the ultimate proof that your most public rock bottom doesn't have to be your final chapter. It can be the bedrock upon which you build a life that is finally, authentically your own. Thought about Elin's metamorphosis? Make sure to leave your comments and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Thanks for watching.